Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum on this Sunday, September the 18th. And as you can see, I'm joined by Pastor Steve this morning. Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Let me tell you what happened Sunday, Steve, and
I think I've already heard.
Okay. We had the topic of our Christians called to be woke and awake, and we were talking about pronouns in particular. Yeah. And we ended the session. It was a very good session. A lot of people shared rich stories, some painful stories. And several people said, we're not finished. We want to continue this conversation next week. That doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, we want to respect it. And I said, well then, Pastor Steve, I am sure will be more than happy to carry on this conversation.
And I am delighted. I'll tell you why. Because I'm delighted we're having these conversations at Emmanuel. I'm glad we have this forum. You always introduce the guidelines that allow us to have kind of civil approaches to this in terms of our language and how we respect each other's opinions. And I think we're growing together, so it merits more than one session.
Good. So let me just say a few things to frame our discussion, then we'll jump in. First of all, during the forum, I corrected some of the statistics from last week's video. And even though we got some of those statistics from some reputable sites, I really think when we're talking about transgender, and that's what we're talking about here, we're not talking about gay and lesbian issues or bisexual, but transgender and what it means to be queer. So in doing that, it's about 1% of the population, about 1%. And what was remarkable is about 3% of incoming college students self-identify as either transgender or non-binary. So that it's an issue. It's a small issue in many ways. It's a big issue in other ways, as we know here in Florida, because it's in the politics and in the papers every day. So I want to say that right off the bat. It's about the T at the LGBT. It's about the T and then what it means to be queer. But before we start, maybe we need to go back and just review a few definitions. We're going to review two definitions, and we want to begin first with the idea of wokeness and being awake. And so let's review that terminology from last week right now. So now let me define what does woke mean, because it's thrown out quite a bit in the papers. Awoke means being alert to injustice in society, especially issues of social justice. And today we're talking more about the sense of woke in terms of transgenders and the use of pronouns. Often the calling cry you hear is stay woke and keep fighting. All right, but there are groups who give a counter movement to the movement of being woke. And they are called, or they self-identify as being awake. And this movement comes often from conservative Catholic circles and evangelicals who say, okay, we also are alert, awake to injustice, but we would define it completely differently. And in terms of these pronouns, we reject the pronouns because we reject the philosophy that supports it. Okay, that was two terms that we began with, but we also now want to move to some other terms or phrases that'll be important again before we enter into the conversation. And here, more definitions, again, that we need to kind of have on our belt so that we can have the conversation. So we want to now again review the clip from last week where we enter in and define, for example, what does it mean to be transgender, non-binary, or queer? Let's review that tape right now. So you hear now a distinction between sex and gender. And I grew up not making those distinctions, I have to be honest, but now often when we read about it in the paper, these distinctions are made. And the first is sex talks about our natal sex, how we were born, our physical biology. And you'd say, oh, okay, like the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve, God made male and female. The scientists say, well, there's also a third category, which is considered intersex. It's a small group, but it's humans who have mixed biologies, okay, that they have some male parts and some female parts. Or sometimes their chromosomes are different than what would be expected. And so that's often considered intersex. And it's not then the clear binary of male and female. That has to do with biology, with sex, at least 3 categories. But now we move to gender, and often in the literature, gender is discussed as a social construct. We all know that, like parents, that, okay, you give dolls to play to girls, right? And baseball bats and gloves to the boys, and then all of a sudden, when they mix and the boys are playing with dolls and the girls are out playing baseball, okay, how do you do with that? Who wears pink, after all? Why is it that we define socially certain roles certain ways? Well, here gender is considered more a social construct. And now here's the thing. If your body corresponds to how you think about yourself, like when I grew up, I had the parts of a boy and I thought myself, yeah, I'm a boy, I'm a male. Then today in the new vocabulary, you're considered cisgender, which means your body corresponds to your gender identity. But so many are not. And so they're often referred to again as being queer when gender identity does not correspond to birth sex. And when you read the papers, other terms are used here, like non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer, and transgender. All those words are used for the same community. Okay, now we've got all those definitions out of the way. Let's jump into our conversation, Pastor Steve. And the first is, last week, as you heard, we had some really good conversations, some rich stories. People shared some difficulties, some areas of protest, some successes in families, which were very supportive. We even had one nurse who had worked in a whole department that dealt with some issues of gender issues. So a lot of new information was out there on Sunday. So I wonder about you. Now, what has been your experiences? We've heard from some people in the church, and they want to continue that conversation this week, but what experiences do you bring to this conversation?
Can I be real candid here? I grew up in a household that didn't even talk about sex or sex-related issues. And that was just the way it was. And so I have to be candid that as I went into the ministry and realized back in the early years of my ministry, I recall a time when I was at a seminar and met a woman whose son she identified as a young man that was coming out as a gay young man. And I learned a lot from her because she said at that point in time, Rick, that when this became an issue in the family, she didn't know where to turn.
Right.
And I think that was the biggest crux of the problem. They didn't know how to talk about it. And I probably would have said the same thing, since we didn't talk about it when I was growing up, where would I turn to get more information? And I think the church became a place that she hoped at the time she would find out more about her son, but it turned out to be an unfortunate situation for them because the church turned her away and said, we don't talk about that either. The book is actually called The Walking Wounded, and it was written by a woman I met years ago, and I learned about that when I was in the Rocky Mountain Synod. But that opened me up to realizing that as a pastor, I needed to become more and more aware of what these issues were in personal lives so that if people had those issues, they could come and we could talk about it within the church and hopefully deal with it in a way that was gracious and brought some new understanding.
I think it's true that we're more adept at talking about gay and lesbian issues in the church because we have gay and lesbians in our congregation who can speak from personal experience. And now more and more people have friends or family members who are gay and lesbian. The transgender issue and the issue of pronouns is a bit more unique. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think that's where we all have to continue to be open to learning on this. And what's happening from what I heard last week is that with people gathered here who were all learning together some new language, that they were able to together process that which is different than if they were trying to do it by themselves, because they did not get the understandings that were coming from other people's insights and opinions.
So as recently,
Yeah.
you've heard about these issues, have heard stories, and of course have had some experiences, both, my guess is, in society, but also here in the church. Are there any biblical or theological resources that have emerged for you that are important tools that you use to help frame the issue?
Well, let me take you back to 2009, when the issue was around ordination of gay and lesbian people within the church. And we at the church said, are we going to talk about this or are we not?
Right.
Well, at the time, the ELCA did put out some guidelines for conversation, biblical conversation, and a lot of churches said, if you'd like to pick a copy up, you can, as you leave church today. But they didn't talk about it within the congregation. We actually talked about it here back in 2008, 2009, leading up to the convention, and found out that it was very helpful to introduce the biblical resources within that community. One funny thing, though, I just have to share this, because when we were done talking about, in the days then, homosexuality and heterosexuality, at the end of the meeting, one woman stood up and she said, I'd like to thank you, Pastor, because you helped me to understand what homosexuality is. We had people coming in and talking about their gender.
Right.
And after she sat down, her husband stood up and he said, honey, before this seminar, we didn't know anything about heterosexuality. So everybody kind of laughed, and I guess there was a little nervousness there, but we were all learning together, and we were actually, I thought, rather gracious with one another.
So I'm trying to imagine someone from our congregation listening to this video, and they know someone. They know someone in their family or a friend who's going through issues of gender identity, maybe issues of what is my identity. I'm not so sure. Maybe there are young people, often it's between the ages of 13 and 17, we know, because we've all been there at one time or another, and they're wondering, what do I do? Are there some concrete steps that I can take? Even if I'm reading in the paper and I read about all these things that are upsetting me, right, that I don't quite understand, but they're so upsetting, I want to close the paper and say, I'm not going to read about this anymore. Again, what can we do to encourage them to stay engaged?
Frustration leads to fear many times, and fear means that people then cut themselves off. And I think what we're trying to do at Emmanuel, we are trying to say, are we not, Pastor Rick, that this is a welcome community where we can talk and discern together. And so don't find yourself isolated. If you're sitting here on a Sunday morning and something comes up and you say, that's my struggle, then please know that we have open doors. Come to talk to one of us. That might be a start. But we can also connect you, I think, within the community to other people who might have some of the same questions. And the key is then we learn together.
There you go. I want to encourage you, if you have those questions, again, to come to the Sunday Forum this Sunday at 10:15, where we continue the conversation here in our congregation. But also you might want to go back to the video from last week where we talk more just about the basic terminology. And again, if that's something where you need a review, it's important because it's not just things we're talking about at church. This is what's happening in our culture, in the papers, in our schools, in our libraries. This conversation now is everywhere in our society, which is why we're addressing it here at Emmanuel. So once again, Pastor Steve, thanks for joining us on the Sunday Forum, and we'll be praying for you Sunday morning.
Thanks for extending it into 2 sessions. I want to be a part of it. Thank you.
Good. Thanks for joining us on the Sunday Forum. Bye-bye now.